Whoops. All right. Well, thank you for staying with me. All right. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to talk a little bit about this green screen. Let me move my audio a little bit closer. I'm hearing it's a little low. Uh, all right. So, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this shot. So, this is a shot a user sent in to me, and they said they were having trouble pulling this green screen, and they wanted to know a good way to do that using our tools. So, what I would normally do is I would suggest using something like Primat Studio for this, and also in conjunction with Mocha masking, because obviously there's a whole bunch of extraneous stuff in this shoot. And let's just talk about this green screen for a second. Like, okay, I can see what maybe they were thinking, but this is not a best practices for a green screen scenario. So, for next time, here's what I would suggest. I would suggest pulling this background tight and getting this model not so close to the background. But you see how the green screen is like 2 feet behind her? That's not what you want. You want to be able to put that a little bit in defocus so that you can merge all those colors together and not so much detail in your green screen. Pulling it tight also helps. Also, doing things like lighting the green screen so that there's not light coming in through the back. Doing things like maybe steaming it would have been a good call. All of those things can help you pull a better green screen. But because this is not a best case scenario, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and isolate this. So we can do this a couple of ways. The first way is that we could use Primat Studio, which is a great tool. And we can also do like an auto analyze to try to pull as much of the green screen away as possible. But, you know, obviously, this is a problematic green screen. So auto action is not going to work very well. So let's look at our final mat here. Oh boy. Let's clean up some of our background. Yeah, okay. We're doing our best here. We can also use our rectangle selection tool to try to do this. And let's try to clean up some of our foreground. Okay. We're looking okay. When we go back to our final composite, obviously there's a lot of problems here. We'd want to feather it and all kinds of things. Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Putting a thick cloth would have really helped, like a lot. But and pulling her like 10 feet forward, any of that would have helped quite a bit. So yeah, so that's not a best case scenario. And this is one of those things where, for example, I had a question from a Netflix production where they were working on a certain royal show, and they had filmed a lot of their promos of a queen in a white wedding dress on a white background, and then they wanted to put black behind her design wise, to sort of do a black and white, really impactful visual design. And I was like, okay, so that's a really cool story. You're going to have to do roto, and you're going to have to do roto, period. So what we're going to do here is the same thing I told them. We're going to have to do roto. Like, yes, Primat Studio is an awesome tool and it can pull some crazy good stuff, but this is a nightmare. And not just because of, you know, it being low res and compressed, but also just because of all of the other issues that they did when they were filming this. So Primat Studio is a good place to start, but honestly, just do roto for this. So we're going to talk a little bit about roto today, and we're going to use Mocha Pro for that. All right, I'm going to delete Primat Studio. Now you can use Mocha inside of Primat Studio, and I do suggest that you do. It's fabulous. It's really great for your workflow and getting rid of all of this other nonsense with inner and outer mats. But that's not happening here. So I'm calling this a roto shot. And you can still clean up green, with Primat Studio or with your other favorite green screen tool, but you're gonna want to roto this, period. Yeah, they might, Chris. But, the spill is the least of my concern. The edges are really my concern here. Um, okay, we've got Mocha on here, and let's go ahead and launch Mocha. I should probably be repeating questions that people ask. So Chris Hero was saying 10 feet forward definitely would help, and Chris Jaden was saying would CPLs help with reducing the green color cast, and I agree that yes. But um, yeah, if you don't have a lot of space, so Chris is saying I have a space where there isn't much room to work with, period, so I can't get that distance separation. Yeah, that's always a problem. For those situations, I would even suggest using those tight green screens that are unfoldable. Because if you've got to be real close up, at least those don't have a lot of creases in them. And the color tends to be a little bit nicer than a piece of cloth. So, what you can do is you can sort of cheat your space. You can also use, a more extreme depth of field to try to get around that as well. Many cheating things that you can try to do. All right. So let's talk about rotoscoping. Rotoscoping is probably what everybody's favorite task out of post. Yeah, everybody? Everybody loves that? What we're going to do is we're going to break this up. So the first thing that I would do is I would try to jump over here and I would make a little shape around her head. Now we have a bunch of different tools that you can use with Mocha for rotoscoping. In this case, I'm just using this X-spline tool right here. So because of that, I'm able to use these really cool features like pull tight for corners and relax for curves. We do have Beziers, they're right here. I don't like using them as much, and I don't recommend that you use them as much because, like, when you try to when you try to correct all the points at once, you end up with some funky results. Also, the nice thing about the X-splines is they work pretty nicely with the planar tracker so that when you tilt them, or move them, they tend to move more uniformly and you end up making less keyframes. So pull tight, excuse me. So pull tight for corners and relax for curves. We also have this show transform tool. Now this can come in really handy if you've got to skew your project here, like skew your shape or move it in perspective. For this, I'm gonna just go turn it off real quick because I don't need it, but it is right here if you need it. When you are tracking for rotoscoping, you can track a couple of ways, but what you don't want to do is track perspective. And here's why. Let me just scroll through this. Do you see how she's moving her head like completely in 360? Or I guess that's a 180, not 360, because she's not going the other direction. Anyway, 180 geometry. So she's moving 180. If I track perspective for that, that's going to be a nightmare. So what we're going to do is we're going to track shear instead, and we might even move to translation only. So let's track forwards here, and we're going to let this track through. There we are, and we're using GPU tracking. GPU tracking usually takes a second or two to start, and then it kicks off real quick through the rest of the footage. So what that means is that you might wait a second or two, but your tracking is going to be quicker overall than if you were using CPU tracking. That is assuming that your GPU is supported. So make sure you're using a supported GPU. If you do find that Mocha won't launch or you're having trouble getting Mocha to track or work on your footage, go ahead and fall back to CPU tracking. Now, you can see we have a little bit of problem here in that her head caught her hand and the movement of that hand. That's not going to matter for rotoscoping. It would have mattered for tracking. So let's let this finish. And luckily her head isn't moving a lot here. And what we'll do is we'll jump back to that frame we started on and then we'll track backwards. And we'll do that for a lot of these shapes. In fact, some of these shapes can use the same exact tracker over and over and over again, which is very handy. All right, so let's let this finish tracking. I want you to think about the tracking time as something that actually saves you time, even though it feels like you're waiting, because any work that the computer is doing instead of you is work that you are not having to do. So just keep that in mind. All right, there we are, and we're going to correct this shape a little bit. And now you can see that this will tween between our keyframes that we've made according to our track. So that's pretty handy. Now let's go ahead and hit track backwards. There we are. Now you can see, because we're not tracking perspective, we're going to actually just move to translation, scale, and rotation. But you can see our shape isn't becoming just a sliver. That's important, because if we let our shape just become a sliver, we're going to have a real hard time. All right, now we've lost the front of her face, so we're going to move this shape over, and then we're going to just retrack right over our data. And that is what we call cheating. So I still don't like how my scale is changing, so we're just going to go ahead and move to translation only. Keep tracking backwards. And now we can adjust our shape at the end. I'm hearing the volume pretty good, so in my monitors. So if your volume is low, is there something you can do to turn it up on your end? Or is everybody noticing a uniform volume that's low? Okay. All right, so we're going to correct this shape, and we're going to correct it over time. Okay, so the way that's going to work is we're going to, well, here, I'll boost my audio. Give me 1 second. Hopefully I don't blow your doors off here. Let's turn it up a little bit. There we go. Hopefully that's a little bit better. Let's turn to here. Hopefully that's a little bit better. There we go. Is that any louder? Okay, let's try a little bit more. All right, how's that? That sounds very muddy to me. Okay, well that is bumped up quite a bit, so hopefully it will help. Okay, so back to shapes here. Okay, wonderful. All right, we're going to correct the shape. Thank you for letting me know about volume. Okay. Hopefully I didn't bust eardrums for anybody else for whom that was fine. And let's correct these. So what we're doing is we're just really quickly correcting our splines over time. All right, and you can see that they're shifting for us. Now, I'm not going to bother correcting where this bun is, because we're going to use a different shape for that, because it crosses a plane, and it just is easier if you don't worry about that. So let's just scroll back here. Yep. And there we go. And we'll just make sure that this shape, we'll delete that. Perfect, because that was a leftover from when I had changed the position of my shape. And because I had auto key on, it did an auto keyframe for me. So very quickly, I'm going to do the same thing for the side of her head here, just like that. And I'm worrying about her chin, but I'm not worrying about her nose. Okay, and again, the reason for that is because we're going to use a separate shape for that. You just don't need to worry about little pieces that stick off. I'm so glad y'all are liking these office hours. I am happy to answer questions as we go as well. All right, so let's scroll between here. Perfect, you can see that that's getting way too big. This is a great time to start using the transform tool, just like that, so that I can correct things over time and in bulk. You can also use the Lasso Selection tool. So we have a Lasso Selection where you can do like this to select points, or you can do Marquee Selection so that you can grab in bulk. If you are working with a Wacom pen, I would suggest using Lasso Selection. If you are working with a mouse, you might want to use a Marquee Selection. Keep in mind, rotoscoping with a mouse is a little bit like rotoscoping with a brick. So I do recommend using tablets where you can for rotoscoping. Now, I am doing these office hours and I am navigating between two different screens, so I'm using a mouse right now. So forgive me as I am not using a tablet and not moving as rapidly as I normally would be. All right, here we are. There we are. All right, so what we want to do is I want to show you one more cool tool, which is, if you've never used it before, you can use this auto stabilize or quick stabilize mode. Now what this will do is this will stabilize your viewer based on the tracking data for the layer that you're on. So we would call this head roto, okay? And now in our drop-down menu, you can see head roto is right here. Or I can just select the shape and use selected layers. So what's cool about that is I can now pin this into the middle of the screen, so I can really see pretty easily where my shape is falling off, and I can see that it's falling off right here. Now with Mocha and Rotoscoping, what you're going to find is that it'll cut your keyframes about in half, and that's great, but obviously, you know, it's not a magic bullet, it's not a wizard. So what it's going to do is you're going to have to correct shapes over time. And sometimes you'll have to correct them more than you would for other shapes. So for this head, I'm not going to have a whole lot of corrections I have to do. But for like her hands, yeah, what I'd probably do there is try to take advantage of garbage mats and green screen. So now that we've got this more or less decent roto for her head, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how to add more shapes to this. So we're going to take our X-spline and I'm going to come in here and just grab her nose real quick. And now I'm going to call this nose roto. I'm going to turn the gear off for my head roto. Would help if I spelled nose right. Okay, and now I'm going to link this to head roto. What this does is this links that to my track. So now I can just animate it and it'll move along with my track. And we'll just put it inside the head here. And then I'll show you a really cool trick, which is if you're working with After Effects, this matters. Other software, it doesn't matter as much because other software tends to respect in and out points, but After Effects doesn't. So we're going to just go one frame backwards and move this right off screen. And so now it's going to pop back on and we'll move back in. So a lot of times I have users ask, how do I have multiple in and out points for an object that's coming on and off screen? Animate it off screen, man. That's all. So now let's go ahead and check and see how this looks. Okay, we're just going to put that right there. And we're going to do a little bit of hand correction here. A little bit of hand correction here. And there. And okay. And now we're going to do that same thing. Jump one forward. Zoom out. And we're going to move this nose right off screen, just like this. So now we've got our nose handled and our head handled. And we'll do the same thing right here. You could use Rotobush on this. Probably you could get away with it because it's mid-range sized. And then you could, if you wanted, take that roto brush, erode it out a little bit, and then use Primat Studio or something to pull the green out. There are many ways to skin a cat. That being said, this is really low res, so you can get away with it. With high res stuff, your mileage is going to vary. You might need to do rotoscoping. So, you know, it's really going to depend. So I'm going to draw a little quick, what this is called a elliptical X-spline layer. This is just a solid that we included so that it's really quick to make squares and circles. And we're going to use this for her bun. And same thing, I'm going to call this bun roto. And we're going to link that to head roto. So now we're just going to correct that. Actually, I don't like the way that links. I don't think that's going to work. So what instead I'm going to do, instead of linking, I'm going to go right back to bun roto and link it to itself. And we're just going to really quickly let that track through using translation only. Boom, boom, boom. And again, if it doesn't look like it's staying where I want it, I'm going to just go ahead and move my shape and tell it to go. And here we are. Wonderful. Track, track, track. And that same thing, I can animate it on and off, or I can trim it right here in layer properties. Just like this. All right, so now we can go ahead and trim that as well, right here in layer properties. Or again, I could animate it on and off screen, depending on how you want to export your data. If I was going to take these as native shapes and put them back into After Effects, what I would do is I would want to animate it off screen. If I'm going to just render it back to the timeline using Mocha, then I would trim the layers and that wouldn't matter. There we are. How to import mats from elsewhere. So Joel wants to know, how would you import mats from elsewhere? Pretty easy. All that you do is you go to the mat clip, you go to import. So, but what you have to do first, I'm jumping ahead of myself. You make a shape, anywhere, doesn't matter. And you go to mat clip and you go to import. And then you just choose whatever you want your mat clip to be. It's going to be a black and white image, and you hit import. Mocha will tell you it's converting the image, and then it will show you a black and white image that you can then see by clicking this mat button right here, this view selected track mats button. The step you're probably missing is probably creating that initial shape first. So what you have to do is you have to make any shape anywhere, and I would just call it like imported mat, you know, and then all you do, mat clip, import, choose, okay. And then again, you can see it just like this. So I hope that answers your question. It does need to be a file, yeah, but that's a wonderful feature quest to have it be a live AE layer. That would be wonderful. But yeah, but what you can do is you can take it in AE and you can render it out as a JPEG that's black and white anywhere, and then load it into Mocha. As Ross said, it needs to be rendered high contrast. Okay, so moving right along, let's talk about how else we tackle this roto. So next, I would probably start thinking about how to divide this up. Now, in general, when I'm creating roto shapes for this, I kind of want to pick a neutral pose that I can find again. So you notice when I got started, I started right over here. Okay, and the reason I got started right over here is because this is pretty neutral. This is like where her body is, and this is where her body is most parallel to the camera. And when you are rotoscoping in Mocha, what you actually want to do is you want to make sure that you are where the object is largest in frame, least blurry, and most parallel to the camera. You're never going to find a perfect situation where it's extremely large in frame and completely in focus and 100% parallel to the camera. But use your best judgment to find out where those three factors intersect best. So now, I think that's about this frame. And what I can do is I can start to rotoscope the rest of her body. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a nice little neck shape. And the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a nice little torso shape. So why am I making a torso shape and not like her whole body? Well, that is an interesting question, Mary, that I'll answer myself. Okay, the reason I'm doing that is because you tend to separate objects by their planar motion. And actually, your hips and your chest move on different axes, right? That's kind of like different planes. So when we think planes, we always tend to think of things like floors, walls, etc. But you need to think of it in terms of motion groups, okay? So like animated pixel groups. So the side of a face is a plane, and the front of a face is a plane, and they're not on the same plane. But a torso is very multiplanar. But for the purposes of roto, the chest moves pretty similarly to the rest of the rib cage, and the hips move pretty similarly to the rest of the pelvis. And if you've got a lot of soft tissue in the middle of your body, I might try to track that separately as well. The dress is screaming for a power mesh track. You are correct. And actually, you can use power mesh for rotoscoping. So I might do that later. All right. So now I've got these tracks that I can do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit track backwards, and I'm probably just going to do translation, rotation, and scale. I'm probably not going to do shear because of her backwards motion. So let's go ahead and hit track backwards. And we're tracking all three of those layers at once. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want to wait on individual tracks, and I'm going to link a lot of tracks to these. So now let's go ahead and zoom out for a second. And I still have my activate quick stabilize mode on, and I don't want that on right now. So I'm going to go ahead and move this shape over. I'm going to go ahead and move her chest shape over. Up, and I see I'm tracking in shear, and I don't want to. Let's go ahead and turn shear off for that. Okay, and now let's go ahead and keep tracking backwards. All right, so we're tracking backwards. And it's doing a nice job of hanging on. But of course, it's not following edges. And it's still scaling a little bit more than I'd like. So let's just move to translation only for all of these. And then let's delete any keyframes that we have that are making it not translation only. Perfect. Okay. And now let's just go ahead and hit track backwards. So if you've got too much of a turn, you might not necessarily want to be using scale or shear. It just depends on what you're tracking. And that's an important concept with Mocha. You're always switching between what the best tracking data is for what you're trying to do. So in this case, the best tracking data I really need is just the sway of her torso here. And let's go ahead and take this, move that over as well. And just hit tracking backwards. And of course, whenever your object moves outside of your shape, you just move your shape. And here's the cool reason for that. The shape is where the track is looking. And a lot of times when people are rotoscoping, they get confused and they think that the shape is what the track is doing. The shape is not what the track is doing, okay? The shape is just where the track is looking, and it moves along with the tracking data. So what does that mean? Well, we have our surface tool right here to show you what the tracking data is doing. And you notice that it's not doing the same thing as the shape. Okay, the reason for that is because Mocha looks at a pattern of pixels that are moving relative to one another. And then it uses that pattern of pixels in order to create a track. When you are creating a rotoscope shape, you are not necessarily looking to be glued to the object because you're tracking a multiplanar object. If you were trying to get a rock solid track, you would probably track one plane at a time. But because we're dividing a human being, an organic subject that is multiplanar, multiplanar, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that our shapes are covering the areas that we need, not necessarily following the best planes for the track. Does that make sense? I hope it does. All right, so I'm not going to worry about correcting those shapes yet, but I am going to go ahead. Actually, yeah, I will, because I'm not going to make you sit through tracking this all the way forward, because it's just going to be the same, just more of the same. See, track. Okay, so we're going to stop this because I don't want us to be all day on a simple rotoscoping concept. Okay, so let's move in and let's talk about how to adjust this. Let's go to our keys using our keyframe navigator right here on the right. I want to point out one thing to you real quick, which is this Uber key. So Uber key is something that's a lot of fun because if you need to do a global correction on a shape, like let's say I want her shoulders to really be into this shape, then what I do is I'd use my Uber key for that. And now watch, no matter what keyframes I've made, it made those changes over my whole entire frame range. Okay, so let's go back over to auto key. Now, if I make a change, it's part of a keyframe. So if I go over here, I can bring this shoulder in. I can bring this shoulder in. And I'll turn off my surface tool so I'm not messing with it. And I'll bring this shape down to her body line and to her back here. Because you see, the curve of her back should be here. And this is where a little bit of a knowledge of anatomy would come in helpful, because then you know the rib cage curves like this. All right, and let's move back over here to this keyframe. And again, we'll do the same thing. We'll make sure that we are including her body in this shape, just like this. All right, and back to here. We're going to keyframe this back to her shoulder. And again, I want to get her trapezius up here. I think that's trapezius, or I guess that's really here. Anyway, yeah, that might be trapezius. It's been a while. It's been a while since art school. Okay, anywho, let's get the curve of her back. Let's see. Joel is asking, to do a better roto job, should we try to adjust the shape or try to adjust the track? I honestly think for roto, it really depends. If you have a track that is absolutely nothing like the movement of the object, then yeah, adjust the track. But if you're dealing with a subject like this, who is turning completely away from the camera, you really just need to get the motion of her body. You're not going to be able to track that accurate turn. And also you wouldn't want to, because your shape would fold in on top of itself and that would not be helpful for your rotoscoping task. So in this case, the reason I went to just translation only, even though that's not the most quote unquote accurate track, is because I wanted the motion of her body to offset the hand animation that I would have to do. But I didn't worry too much about whether or not that's accurate to the 100% pure motion her body is making. So now if we come over here, this is where this is going to pay off, because now as I've corrected this shape, it still should move appropriately with how her body's moving. You just got to get through that transition point, because you got to think of rotoscoping in terms of traditional animation. Okay, so you're doing a bunch of tweening, and you're doing tweening. See, look, do you see how I'm getting that nice shake now? Now, we could have gotten that shake in its entirety if we had used something like Power Mesh, but you have to weigh how long something like a Power Mesh track would take versus how long a planar track would make, and whether or not it's worth it to just do the hand corrections over time for that. So that's what I would suggest. All right, moving right along. There we go. That's where our tracking dead ends. Okay, so let's go ahead and correct her body according to the same. And then we'll talk right before we go, because we are running out of time, because obviously rotoscoping takes a minute. We're going to talk a little bit about Power Mesh for this skirt. Okay. So let's just correct this real quick. Now you see what I did there? I accidentally made a keyframe that was right beside another keyframe, and I just deleted the old keyframes so that I didn't have to deal with that. All right, let's go ahead and move this here. The reason I did that is because you don't want a whole bunch of keyframes right beside each other, because look, let's see, I'll just try to correct this by hand, like one frame at a time. And I will show you why that's a bad idea. So now, look how ugly that looks. You're going to see that. You're going to see that bounce. And we don't want that bounce in our rotoscoping, because even if our rotoscope is like 1 or 2 pixels off, as long as the motion looks right, you're not going to notice. But if you have a jittering edge, you are going to notice. So Joel is asking, what kind of roto should we not do in Mocha, but do in Silhouette instead? Well, a good thing to do in Silhouette instead of in Mocha would be hair. Because we can do open splines. So I'll show you right here. You know, obviously, we can, you can make this an open spline, you know, and we can make it curve if we want to, and it's beautiful and everything. But then wherever we take this, we're going to have to stroke it automatically in another piece of software. In Silhouette, you can just paint the hair and animate the spline, and that might be a little bit better. Okay, now let's just continue correcting this real quick. There we are. And we end up with something that looks, well, halfway decent when we're rushing. Let's talk a little bit about Power Mesh, because I feel like we've explored these concepts pretty well. Let's talk about Power Mesh. All right, so we've got this skirt here. We want to grab the motion of this skirt as well as we can. So let's call this hips real quick, and let's call this torso, and let's call this neck. Now, in general, name your layers, especially if you're working with other people, but, you know, past you will think future you. So let's see, or I'm sorry, future you will thank past you for doing that. Okay, so I'm going to take my X-spline and draw a shape around this skirt. I could also use the magnetic spline tool, which, you know, tries to find edges as best it can. this is great for some work. This is a pretty elaborate skirt, so I'm probably going to go ahead and do a manual shape, just like this. We also want to make sure that we're on a frame where the skirt is not blurring. Okay, here we are. Let's go ahead and make this shape here. You can hear my mouse clicking. I'm going to avoid that hand there, and we're going to track this. So we're going to call this skirt roto, or we might even call it skirt track, depending on if we use this as, well, we would want to use it. We would want to use it as the track layer and the roto layer, because Power Mesh is actually limited right now in layer linking. So you can only use Power Mesh on the layer that you are working on. You can't link it, but that's a feature. Okay, so we're going to do a uniform mesh track here, and we're going to go ahead and track forwards. And we already have warp spline checked by default, which means the spline will warp with our Power Mesh over time. So now what Mocha is doing is it's doing a series of planar tracks, just a bunch of little ones, and it's moving those along with a larger planar track. So that is represented by smoothness. So 50% smoothness is probably a pretty good setting for this dress, but if it were a pretty firm object, I would want to crank the smoothness up, because I wouldn't want a lot of jiggle in my track. But if I were trying to track something that was, say, really jiggly, then I would want my smoothness down. And that's because I want to get all the subtle movement. So something like a liquid would be like a smoothness of 0, and you're going to get little planar tracks all over the place. Something like a piece of paper might be a smoothness of 90. You know, you want to make sure that you retain that rigidity, but get a little bit of the bend. Does it affect Power Mesh if perspective is not checked, but yes is? Yes, and that's because there is a major planar track underneath that's guiding everything, and I'm pretty sure you can't get an accurate, pretty sure you won't get a very accurate planar track if you don't use perspective with Power Mesh. Now, that being said, all of the limitations of an object turning away from the screen or having a bunch of occlusions, that's going to be affected, and Power Mesh might not be the best choice for something that has really harsh shadows in it, or a lot of movement, or a ton of occlusions. You can track around occlusions, but you're still tracking a bunch of little mini planar tracks. And you can still use occlusion layers, but when you use occlusion layers, you got to make sure that your occlusion layer is really massive, because any of that edge blur or anything like that, Power Mesh will read all of that. It's extremely sensitive. So whereas the planar tracker has a little bit less sensitivity, the Power Mesh has quite a bit of sensitivity. So just make sure when you're shooting, you keep that in mind. Change the color of the shape so we can differentiate it from the mesh. Yes, you can do that right here. Hold on. Let's change it to, let's change it to yellow. There we go. And I'll zoom in so that y'all can see. All right, and keep going. So here you can see the outline of the mesh, and you can see the red and blue is the mesh itself. I'm sorry. So the yellow's outline of the shape, and red and blue is your mesh. All right. So once that's complete, we can start to adjust the edges. Now, Power Mesh does not like edges as much as the planar track does. So when you're tracking an object, you tend to want to track kind of either directly at the edges or inside the object. Whereas the planar tracker loves finding the edges. So let's turn our Power Mesh off. And let's scroll through and see what this did with my shape. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my original shape. And we're fixing to run out of time, so I'm going to make this quick. I'm going to adjust this to be the skirt shape more exactly. Okay, so just like this. We'll do some curves here, just like this. Here we are. And we're pressing X so that we get that hand tool, the pan tool. And here we are. We'll make that this. Okay, and also, I'm going to use this Add Points to Spline tool, the point insertion tool. I'm going to come in here and adjust my shape a little bit, whereas I didn't when I originally started my track. Now, I didn't want it when I was starting my track because if you have a whole bunch of little points, they're a lot to keep track of. I guess that's a pun. It's an unintentional pun, which may be the best kind of pun. Okay, now here we are. Move that there. All right, so now let's go back to our selection tool. Let's use our selected layer auto stabilize tool, and let's check this out and see how that's moving. Now it's not perfect, but boy, that's going to save me a lot of time. So let's do some corrections. Just like this. You get all of that secondary motion for basically free. So Joel is asking, what is the shortcut for the magnet tool? So there is a magnet tool, and what that'll do is that will try to find the edge of a hard edge. So it's Alt S on Windows. Okay, Alt S. And you can do a couple of shapes, a couple of points at a time. I don't recommend that you do a whole bunch of points at a time. Okay, do a handful. All right, so you notice that I did my correction there at the end and not some random point. Okay, I did it at the end because now I can look for where the shape is the most off, and then I can correct from there. And I wouldn't want to use my snap shortcut for this point here because you see how transparent this dress is and it's green. It's going to have a hard time with that edge. But if you can find an edge, then Mocha can. Okay, but if you have to judge it based on your, best judgment and knowledge of anatomy, chances are you're going to not want to use an auto snap for that. All right, so just like this. There we are. So now we just did not quite get where she was fluffing out her skirt with her fingers, but that's okay because that can be hand animated. There we are. And now let's just correct this. Perfect. All right, so now we've got a pretty good shape on her skirt. So we've hit the end of our hour, and I appreciate you guys hanging out and hanging in. I am so sorry that we had a little bit of a snafu with our audio there, but I'm so glad that that is solved. And let's just look at this playing. Let's turn auto stabilize off. There we go. All right. So these are office hours. We're going to try to do these about once a week. And we're thinking about Tuesdays. And what I'm going to do is basically, if y'all have shots that you want to see, send them in. And what we'll do is we'll troubleshoot them. So this was a shot that a user sent in that they were having a lot of trouble with. And we talked a little bit at the beginning of this, what the problems were and how to solve those. And we ended up doing a rotoscoping demo because of this. This is 100% unscripted. It's 100% live, and we're answering your questions live. So be sure to tune into the next several ones that we do. We're going to do these once a week. Like and subscribe. If you liked what you saw here, definitely hit that thumbs up button. And please stay tuned to the Boris FX channel so that you can find more of our tutorials. Boris FX Learn is a great place to learn, and also follow our regular Boris FX page, especially for our live streams. All right, have a great day, guys. Thank you so much.